It's always a pleasure to talk with the sharp-dressed man, DG Chichester, and I can confirm, as of recently in Richmond, Virginia, a real person outside of Zoom as well. We broke outside of the box. We were thinking outside of the box, as they say.
It was great seeing you in person, and it is always interesting to get proportions on people because we all seem like we're very small and tiny, and unless you have a very big monitor, I guess. So no, it's delightful meeting you in person, Jason, and great to reconnect on the show.
Absolutely great to connect with you, and I'm delighted to report that I'm shorter in person, but you are taller in person. So it evens out. It evens out a
It
little bit.
does. It does. Although I'm told I've shrunk over the years, so as we all probably do, as you compress, but I do what I can.
Yes. Gravity has its effects. As Steve Martin said, I turned 70 this year and 5'9".
Yeah,
So,
that's about it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, of course, folks out there will know you for work in the Marvel Universe and
hmm
amazing contributions to this wide world. But we're talking on this episode about a brainchild of yours, and that is Risk,
Yes.
Rysk.
Yes, in the best tradition of modern day misspellings of common words. So it could be a an internet company, I guess, with that, which is sort of where the play on words, came from a little bit. So
I like
um,
it.
yeah, it's fun. And it is
And
the brainchild of me and I should say, Dimitrios Zaharakis, who is the publisher and editor of Black Box Comics. So as we'll get into it, he sort of came to me with the beginnings of the idea, and then we worked it through to something similar but different.
I love the high concept nature of it, and Risk is an identity in this
hmm
book. It's not just sort of a clever play on words, but someone who is an active, integral aspect of the plot. So, yeah, looking forward to talking through how all of this weaves together and anything that you want to say about working with Black Box, because I've already tipped that you've worked for the big two and in the comics publishing world, but curious about that more independent creator owned sort of space.
Yeah, well, I mean, to some degree, I came out of a creator-owned, space, even though this is owned, I should again be clear, by Black Box. I have creator participation, in it when
Hmm.
it takes off big, which of course we hope it does. But it's a fortuitous kind of road, I think, in the sense that it came out of the big publisher work that I had done, specifically Fall from Grace, which Dimitrios was a big fan of. And his actual launch title when he began Black Box was, I believe it's called the IT department, which he did with Scott McDaniel because he really liked the work Scott and I had done. And he had approached me several years ago to do something, um, a different book, not this one. And I was not in a great place, then. And I didn't pursue it in the right way. But fortunately, he's a very forgiving character. And uh, several years later, it was actually the summer that I was also approached about what would become Daredevil Black Armor. And so I got CB Sobolski, and then an hour later, Demetrios comes up and sort of says, "Hey, let's connect and let's talk about things." And so that began, the genesis of what this would become. But it's been um, 99% of the time I've been very fortunate with the people I've worked with, like creators, editors, and in this case, the same thing. Demetrios always seems to have a very oddball, out there idea for something. The initial pitch for this was she's a bookie, which she is, and the main character, who would become this main character, Ruby Chance, and not the first thing you think about for an adventurer character. At least I wouldn't. It's often whatever, ex-military, a lawyer, police officer, something. So a bookie didn't, strike me as the most obvious way in, which is great. But he spun out a few other ideas, and then I was able to run with it. And so I think his genius a little bit is in coming out with these off kilter ideas, and then trusting somebody like me enough to run with it. and which he did. You know, I was able to kind of build a world around this and keep the core of his idea, but take it in a much different way than I think he or I actually anticipated.
Yeah. Yeah. You play with a lot that I enjoy in sci-fi universes, the dystopian world, they
Hmm.
sort of pulling in resources, building oneself, and then even some AI ideas that are mixed in there, which is a very hot button issue right now, and
Sure.
definitely current conversation. So, anything that you would like to share with listeners about what the plot revolves around, other than what I just said?
Yeah, I think a good basis, you know, for it would help the conversation. I mean, essentially, it's a bit of a time in the future, not hundreds of years, thousands of years, you know, maybe a good 20, 30 years, by my estimation, where a young woman named Ruby Chance has developed an early AI prototype, you know, of some types that she thinks will help her get an edge in business. She hopes to sell this service, you know, to businesses so they would have a strategic edge, you know, in the world and the world of business. But as she's preparing to sell this algorithm, out, the world kind of goes to hell in a handbasket. Something happens. It's a plan to kind of forestall climate crisis goes badly awry, and it releases a bacterium or something from buried in the Arctic, and it comes to be known as the melt. Because it's a sort of form of necrotizing fascisis, or can't never quite pronounce it, but the flesh-eating disease.
Mhm.
And and it hits mankind hard, and it really literally melts parts of people away. They lose limbs and features, and the only way that everyone who's affected by it is able to regroup is by using off-the-shelf technology, which has been infused with some form of AI or other. You know, we're enough in the future where almost everything has some kind of AI component to it. So these are smart technologies, but not necessarily intended for human augmentation. But emergency surgeries happen. These things are called graft tech, and they give people the ability to walk around or look halfway normal, and in some cases have a little bit of augmented uh, abilities. But what
Mhm.
happens with Ruby is a bit different. She gets some of those additions to recover her physical abilities, but for some reason, this algorithm that she was developing becomes active in her skull and becomes a persona, which she names Rysk. And that
Mhm.
was going to be that was the name of the algorithm. That was what she was going to sell. And Risk gives her a number of strategic advantages. Now she can look at a situation and predict what's going to happen based upon all the odds. You know, as a bookie, you know, she's literally seeing the odds in front of her. And it's also giving her some preliminary or early audit control over her autonomic abilities. So normally, you know, how much we breathe, how much our heart rate goes, how much adrenaline kicks through us is not under our control. But through the advice and counsel of this thing in her head, she's able to start to control certain things. So she can run a little faster or react a little quicker than the people around her, which also gives her an edge. So she hasn't let this out into the world. Everyone just thinks her augments are an arm, you know, part of her face and this sort of thing. But
Mhm.
she's trying to understand why this happened to her and uh, what she can do with it aside from now running this betting operation that she does in this kind of fractured world to make a living for her and the crew that's around her.
Again, very high concept, and I love just the layers. The this leads to this sort of component of the story, and it takes me back to like William Gibson stories that I've
Hmm.
enjoyed, and Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, and some of those things that I've really dug into. So, just curious about what it's like to play in that sandbox of science fiction storytelling.
You know, that's a great question, and I can only think that it was like a long gestating thing. I'd never really, you know, obviously any superhero comic has a lot of sci-fi elements built into it, but I don't think that I've
Hmm.
ever
Hmm.
pure played sci-fi before. And this wasn't part of Dimitrios' initial pitch. There was nothing about a cyber world or, technology or anything like that. But the first place I would stop in a bookstore as a kid was the science fiction section, which in those days, since my hair is very white, not even gray anymore, very white. It was a very small section at the back of the bookstore. I remember it very distinctly. And it was all those exact authors. Maybe not Gibson, so much. He would come maybe a little bit later, but Asimov, Clark, Heinlein, this was sort of my bread and butter, much more so than say fantasy. And so this was the stuff I would devour. Harlan Ellison, Dangerous Visions was kind of like a Bible for me. And so I think that so much of that was maybe looking for an opportunity to come to life.
Mhm.
That when this open canvas was here before me, right, literally build a world, it kind of leapt to the fore. And so it was a very interesting space to start to play in and spin things out. Although it did require uh, building out a world that there's nothing to depend on. There's no, we've said it in a certain couple locations, but all the characters are new, the tech is new. As you'll see in a future issue, there's a sort of a worldwide sporting event that a lot of people know. We had to invent that, so
Mhm.
it was a lot of. I said to Demetrios afterwards, the next one, I'm just going to have one character in a warehouse with a cardboard box. It'll be a lot easier.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Uh, in terms of that world building, was that a conversational process? Was that something that kind of you stored away in a notebook? Was it something that you tinkered with as you went? How did that unfold?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of notebooking. There was certainly a lot of certain things came to me very quickly. The melt, that incident that happened sort of jumped to my mind, as a sort of
Hmm.
inciting event. Something's going to screw up this world. And that's going to affect the main character. And that main character, who became again Ruby Chance, is, what happens to her aside from, what's the edge that she gets? How does she get this odds making, edge? So probably that was the first thing that came to mind. And then sort of backwards engineering that around, all right, what's the technology? Does everybody get the technology? Are there different layers of the technology, which there are? There's the street level craft tech, which is, again, just people pulling off the shelf technology. Then there was a certain level of elites in the world. They're called the primes, who just have more money, and they've been damaged as well, but their augmentations are a lot sleeker, a lot more high end. So it was just putting that together and trying to make sense of it, and then sending that off to Demetrios and saying, well, here's what I've cooked up. It's not what you think it's going to be, probably. What do you think of it now? And again, he was very receptive to taking that initial idea which he had, which was a bookie who's got some telepathic or other edge on odds making, and has a bit of a heart of gold, although a bit of a hard edge as well. And then, somehow, playing that out against ulterior forces. That was it's more than that, but I mean that's kind of the essence of which I built on. But the more you get into it, the more that starts to kind of pattern itself out. And when I started to write this, which was around the same time as Daredevil Black Armor, this was as AI was starting to kind of break out larger in our own world. So, um, I questioned a little bit of, well, is the real world going to overtake this too quickly, or am I going to be at odds with some of that? But I think fortunately, I just kind of leaned into the story and let it take its own course versus
Hmm.
getting second guessing myself, I guess, around that.
Yeah. Yeah. And talking about the augmentations based on class, uh, science fiction also has this wonderful way of it's fun, it's an adventure, but there's some commentary that's woven in, some of that
No.
Heinlein kind of like. uh, social critique, along with the explosive things that are happening.
I think that's always, the interesting case, and I mean, with science fiction especially, and that then, there's always that thought of, is it projecting the future or is it commenting on the, is it going into the future to comment on the present, which I sort of lean a bit more into in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of ways, without getting on a soapbox and hopefully and commenting about that, because you
Yeah.
sort of step ahead a little bit and that allows you to kind of play certain things out, but at the same time, reflect on our world. And hopefully, I think also try to inject some hope into it because and I think it does get there as the story goes on and the decisions that are made, by the characters and where it ultimately lands. Dystopia is really easy, and there's a lot of dystopia in science fiction, and then especially I think science fiction television. But it gets quite grim, doesn't it? I think
Well,
and the thing about science fiction, I think for me, that was especially appealing was I want to be there. I want to be where Asimov is going, or I want to, get more current. I want to live in the world of the expanse.
mhm,
I want my reality to be for all mankind. These things have troublesome things, but there's that sense of there's more potential for us. And
yeah.
the high watermark for many of us, I think, is Star Trek at its best, right? It overcame whatever issues went on in that world to get to something that was about exploration and and science and adventure in a pretty amazing way. And I tried. This story is not that, but I think reaching for that brass ring in a story like this is part of what makes it interesting from a creative point of view.
Yeah. Yeah. And you get to tell it within the space of a comic as well. So there's a cinematic quality that can come along with
Hmm.
it. So anything that you'd like to say about the art style and how it supports the story and how all of that collaboration came together.
Yeah, I mean, Mannix Francisco is the artist on it, and he's done, I think, a very energetic, terrific job in terms of the storytelling, and the visualization of the characters. But it is sort of an interesting twist of when I started it and the way I wrote it was very gritty. And I had actually said to Demetrios, and we've gone back and forth, that we didn't want it to feel cyber, cyber whatever, cyber punk, cyber, whatever, 27/7 or whatever. Um, but that's what Mannix kind of did. It ended up having a very sleek look. Um,
Mhm.
and that's part of the collaborative part of comics. Could I have gone back and insisted, no, 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 it needs to be all this?
Mhm.
Or do you lean into what's getting him excited, which he seemed to be, and he was, and then, follow that through because then everybody's energized. So was it so important that the whole thing was, had a grit filter on top of it? Or is it more important that we're sort of interpreting, the right things and making everybody in that collaborative process energized around it? And ultimately, I think it's better for that. So in my mind's eye, right? It wasn't that, but now it is. So that's fine. I'm like very comfortable. The storytelling is really what it's all about, and that's very strong. And the characters, I think, deliver in terms of oddity and impact and emotion. So I think there's a good a really good balance in the way he's represented everybody.
Uh, and such a great history of science fiction in comics from
Hmm.
you're talking about the superhero avenues that get explored, which are very much science fiction stories, but then even the EC comics and
Oh,
the
sure.
science fiction stories that were afforded there of I'm not just describing for you this world in this space. Here you can see it on these panels and you can see these people exploring it.
Right, right. And yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
those were, wondrous adventures, often horrific when you're with the EC, even in the science fiction ones. But oh,
True,
look,
true.
how many tentacles does that thing have? But that's that strangeness, was also part of the appeal of science fiction. And for me, was a big fan of horror as well. When you got those two crossing over, that was always nice. Although those worlds were ones I was maybe less interested in actually visiting, with the, the the tentacle monsters and such. But
Yeah, yeah. You were talking about bookstores. I was just in a classic style bookstore yesterday that had a
hmm
science fiction section in the back, and right
hmm
next to it is the horror section. So they definitely share that sort of space. And then up here is the fantasy. So it's all on one wall. It's just how much of a dash of this do you put in versus this, or what do you leave out?
Right, right. And I guess, it's the interest of the bookstore and the bookstore owner. But I remember
Right.
it was Barrett Books. I remember it to this day. I remember, you know long thin classic bookstore. It was like go straight back to that one little set of shelves that it was on, and the other bookstore in my town was one called Walden Books, and it was
Oh,
little
yes.
shelf of like science fiction, and right next to that maybe one little like column of horror, which was always dominated by the H.P. Lovecraft books that I was too scared to buy for a long time. But
Hmm.
because they had very disturbing covers. But they're gateways. I mean, they're gateway drugs, they're gateway things that then open your mind and your excitement to many things. And then when you start to, at least for me, you start to see like cross-fertilization of things that you really enjoyed. I was a big fan of The Twilight Zone, and then realizing, well, gee, C.M. Kornbluth wrote this Twilight Zone episode. I mean, it was based on a story of his, so that leads me to read, Kornbluth's work, or
Hmm.
recognizing Matheson, in the same way, and then I read Matheson's work. And so for me, so many of these things were back and forth between them and led to much wider reads. And now that we're talking about it, I'm going to go back and have to reread all these things.
That's how the good stories go, right? You have to
Yeah,
revisit. Yeah.
totally.
Uh, you're talking about that visual style, which does create the possibility for some optimism there. And then I was also
hmm
going to add the coloring. The color palette really goes really nicely with the art as well.
It does. And I think, you just actually identified something that gets back to that hope. It's not a utopian world, but I'm actually
Hmm.
quite I think the hopeful aspects of the story, which there are, this character is striving for something for herself. She's striving for something for this team of bookmakers, who are kind of like her surrogate family that she sort of assembled around herself. Um, Ultimately, she will make decisions in the story that are more about that than any self-serving thing. And this
Hmm.
risk persona will put her at a crossroads of, well, what are you going to do with all this? I like the fact that it looks as sleek as it does, and that
Yeah.
palette is as energetic as it does, because it does lean towards something maybe more hopeful, more energized than if it had had that grit filter,
Hmm.
then that would have been like a muddier, rougher world. And maybe I would have, I mean, I wrote it full script, which is not my preference necessarily, because I like to react to the art more.
Hmm.
But even so, seeing it, gave me a new feeling about it as I started to see the art, and I was probably still doing, some of the latter issues. So to me, the whole package has come together, really, really nicely.
Yeah, it was a satisfying read, I will say, and great to see you in person. As we mentioned at the outset, we were talking about Risk, and I got to look through some pages. So wonderful to see it in the physical media as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it comes out next week. Diamond, or what's left of Diamond, cooperating with the world, which I believe it is.
Mhm.
So, and then it's a 5 issue series. So, and Black Box tends to collect these after they've, done the whole mini series. Folks have that to look forward to as well.
Yeah, yeah. So Black Box is a place to go to find this. Any other
Yes,
spots that you'd like to mention?
it should be, at the comic shops. I mean, I don't know if every comic shop will order it. It's a smaller publisher. But if you go to your local comic shop and you like it, I always advocate supporting your local comic shop and asking them to order it. But if you go to blackboxcomics.net, um, uh, it is on their homepage right now. I mean, they have 20 odd, if not more, titles, but you can order the first 2 issues, I believe, directly from the site as well. So that's probably um, the easiest way, to get it. And believe there's digital copies as well, but certainly the print copies are available through that.
Yeah. Now, what is next for you, and where can we find out more about your work?
Well, if you go to my newsletter, which is actually back to being current and has been for several months, knocking on wood, um, is storymaze.substack.com. So, and right now, actually, up through next week, I've been running sort of uh, previews of Risk, which has included uh, really the initial pitch. So I took the initial pitch that I sent to Black Box, and so if you read it through, you sort of get how I broke down, the initial story pitch. So if you go back, you'll see how I took it across, like the different parts of the storyline, and broke it down for them. So a little glimpse behind the scenes there. I also have another thing from Black Box coming out. Probably, I would think, by the end of this year. The way it seems to be tracking, which is a totally different genre. So it's a sword and sorcery approach, which kind of came with the same thing from Demetrios. Here's an idea. What do you think of it? And I had a chance to run with that, but we're not talking about that one in as much detail, quite yet.
Mhm,
And there's
mhm.
also a Kickstarter book that I'm working on, which we may talk about later. But if folks want to jump on it, they can go to axlesinfernal.com, axlesinfernal.com. It's a supernatural roadhouse, grindhouse, I should say, sort of adventure. And folks
Mhm.
can see what's going on with that, and they could see the link to the uh, Kickstarter pre-launch. So it's not launched on Kickstarter yet. We're trying to, get interest going, and that's a lot of fun.
Cool, cool. All cool things. I hope you will come back to talk Axel's Infernal and all the Kickstarter things sometime in the near future as well.
That would be awesome. Thank you, Jason. This is always a pleasure. I always like,
Yeah,
chatting with you. We get right to it. And thank you for checking the book out and apparently enjoying it. And
I
and
did. I
keep
did.
keep you up on the next ones.